That's a pretty great bookstore. Been hearing about it, and I came down earlier today to look it over a little bit. I'll tell you how I got started on this project. I was working for Bush Sr., but my boss was Bush Jr. Actually, George W. Bush, but we called him Jr. sometimes then, and sometimes he called himself Jr. Later, writers I notice will often correct people who say George Bush Jr., but I would sit in his office many a time when he would get on the phone and he would say to some stubborn secretary on the other end, "Tell him George Bush Jr. is calling." So he was George Bush Jr. when he wanted to be, but he was George W. to us, and he was my immediate boss, and his dad had won the election, so he was now president-elect. We were sitting in his office talking about who's going to go to transition, who's going to go to inaugural, who's going to go into the White House, and who isn't. And as we were sitting there chatting, at a certain moment he sighed and he said, well, now what's going to happen to me? Which was surprise to me. It was a rare moment for him. He didn't talk or think a lot about himself, and I hadn't either. But I had written thousands of pages for his pop, and so I immediately suggested, well, you want me to write a book? Or yeah, it'd be good. It ended up a book. You want me to write a memo on presidential kids? And he said, sure. So when you're in a political campaign like that and it's over, whether you win or lose, there's a depression that sets in because you're just going full blast, and it's like a train. You hit the wall, bang, it's over. It's done. So I had a staff of eager young people who were ready to go. There was nothing to do. They were waiting for transition to kick in. So I gathered them around, and I said to them, hey, we got 30 days. Let's put together a memo for George W. on presidential kids. What happens to them? And so we hit the Library of Congress, flush with the victory of a president-elect. We even contacted some presidential children of former presidents and put together a 44-page memo in about 30 days. And it was fascinating. I mean, there was everything: romance, illicit love, murder. I was very surprised by how ignorant I was of presidential children, and I thought of myself as an amateur historian. I loved history. I was just shocked at the stories. I was shocked at the impact that presidential children have on history. I mean, it makes sense. Our children impact our lives and our careers, so it makes sense, but I had never seen it. Eliza Monroe comes to mind. She was President Monroe's daughter, and he had another daughter who was getting married, the younger daughter, Maria, and Eliza was running the White House. The mother was ill. By the way, that's a common theme. There are all these books. You'll find a lot of books in this bookstore about first ladies, and many of those first ladies, especially in early American history, gave birth to so many children that by the time their husband was elected president, their bodies were worn out, and it was a daughter that ran the White House. The histories of the first lady, but there's a couple first ladies who never entered Washington. I guess you know about some of those. If not, I'll tell you. But anyway, some very insightful stories, and the one of the Monroe daughter is that Eliza had gone to a school in France, graduated from that school, came to the United States, and really felt more continental than she did American, and was a bit offended by the frontier culture of America. And so she tried to impose on the White House the refinement that she'd picked up in France, and in the process, I guess this happens and shouldn't be surprised, in the process offended, of all people, the French and Spanish and English diplomats. It was the Europeans who didn't like her version of what European society should be like. And so this feud developed between the Monroe daughter and the diplomatic corps in Washington, D.C. And so when Maria had a wedding, Eliza, her older sister, stepped in, took it over, and refused to let any of the diplomats come to the wedding. Well, this was the first big wedding in American history. This was the first time a presidential daughter was going to get married, and of course the tradition the tradition in Europe, marriages were state events. They were the mergers of kingdoms. They were hotly debated before they took place and after they took place. And so the Europeans were used to having big weddings, but they were not used to being shut out. And so there was a big argument about it at poison cabinet meetings. And I tell you that whole story to say that when James Monroe and John Quincy Adams, his Secretary of State, sat down to forge the Monroe Doctrine, the Monroe family was pretty bitter towards many of those European kingdoms anyway. And Eliza had her little role to play in the Monroe Doctrine and to strengthen the spine of her father, who made it his policy that no one should interfere from in the Western Hemisphere, or that was a threat to the United States. But my first reaction in doing that study was one of fear, because I liked GW. I was working for him, and I started on the study for purposes of finding out what it was going to be like for him. And what I noticed is, and in these 15 years of researching this subject, what has only been confirmed is that if a firstborn son is named after the father, or if he's brought in the White House to work for the father, which happened on several occasions, or he is in some other way positioned as the heir apparent, they die. Well, we all die, but they die young. And John Adams II, for example, died an alcoholic at 31. William Henry Harrison Jr. died an alcoholic at 35. Andrew Johnson Jr. died at 26. Calvin Coolidge Jr. died at 16. He was injured on the White House tennis courts. He developed a blister and turned to septicemia, blood poisoning, and he died. Andrew Jackson Jr. was killed in a hunting accident, died of lockjaw after a hunting accident. I could go on and on and on. It just... it's uncanny. There's a few juniors that survived. A good example is Teddy Roosevelt Jr. He lived to be 54. That's old for an heir apparent. But he tried. I mean, he was so reckless that Teddy Roosevelt once told his wife that if he survives to adulthood, it'll be a miracle. And I've got a picture in the book, All the President's Children, that shows T.R. Jr. jumping a fence on a horse with T.R. watching on. He was very reckless. In World War I, T.R. Jr. was wounded twice. In World War II, he was in the heat of battle. He was the first in the landings in North Africa. And, you know, if you've studied a lot of World War II, the North Africa landings seem pretty tame. I mean, it seems like they came up to the dock and they all walked off. But T.R. Jr. killed somebody on the beach. He shot a German in the head in hand-to-hand combat on the beach. He was the first to land in Sicily with the first wave in Sicily. And, of course, he was a general by that time. He was in the first wave that landed on D-Day, and he was the only general to land with his troops in the first day and the first wave in the D-Day invasion. In fact, in the movie The Longest Day, Henry Fonda plays T.R. Jr., and he stands out there on the beach with his cane. He's hobbling around, and these bullets are whizzing by him. General Abrams was asked at one point what was the bravest act he'd ever seen in his life, and he said it was T.R. Jr., the story of T.R. Jr. standing out on that beach in Normandy. And so he stood there, a man in his 50s, with his cane, directing the young people who were landing on the beaches of Normandy where to go and where the German machine gun nests were and what to avoid, with bullets whizzing all around him. So he tried, but he died of a heart attack at 54 a few months after Normandy and was awarded the Medal of Honor. So I was disturbed by what I found. Higher than average rates of divorce, higher than average rates of alcoholism, higher than average rates of premature death. And my boss was named after his father, too. So I presented this study to him rather timidly because I knew him, and I know that, you know, he can't be stampeded into anything, and he's understated, and as his pop and the whole family is. So I just kind of gave it without comment, and he looked through it a little bit. And the only comment that he had, at one point, there was a very eerie mirror between the George Bush family, Sr., and the Franklin D. Roosevelt family, in that each had 4 boys and a daughter, and each had a 6th child that died early. One of the Roosevelts went west, and so did one of the Bushes. One of the Roosevelts went to Florida and was elected to office, and one of the Bushes had gone to Florida and was Secretary of Commerce at the time. And FDR Jr. went home to New York, the home state, to run for governor. And it was no secret that GW was thinking about that. So he asked me, it was the only question he asked about the study. He said, well, what happened to FDR Jr.? I said, he lost. And I said, in fact, no presidential son has ever been elected governor. And he groaned, and that was his only reaction. And then it went into file 13. And for 15 years, I've been clipping and pasting and correcting my 44-page memo, which has become a 600-page memo. But when John F. Kennedy Jr. disappeared over the Atlantic, I had chills go down my spine because I thought, this is not a coincidence of history. This has happened over and over and over again. There is stress on these young people. From the time they're little children, people come up to them and say, well, when are you going to run for president? If they bear the name Andrew Jackson Jr., Andrew Johnson Jr., Calvin Coolidge Jr., if they bear the name, it's killer. And I had someone the other day talking to me about this very same thing, and they said, well, George W. Bush escaped all that, and he didn't. He had a drinking problem. He was headed with all the confidence of a sleepwalker right down this same path that other juniors had gone, and he took charge in his life and made a decision and changed, turned it around, but he was headed that way. So in this study, there was good, too. There were some fabulous stories. And let's say one last thing about JFK Jr. just before I get off him. Jackie Kennedy is one of the best of the moms. When you read this book, you're going to conclude, boy, she did lots of things right. And when most of you are familiar with her childhood and you know some of the traumas she experienced as a child, which makes it all the more admirable. She was a great mom. And it's no accident that John and Carolyn were as classy as they were and as we expected them to be. But before she died, she could not resist. And Jackie Kennedy's last note to her son before her death was, you especially have a place in history. And, of course, 5 years later, he was gone. So there is tremendous stress on these young people to live up to the image of the father. If you're not named after the father, you might slip away. For example, I found one of the living children of a president living on an island at work. The local newspaper, we called them first, said, "We hear this guy." They said, "Well, we hear he lives here too, but we don't know." So I thought, well, the local editors don't know, and it's an island, they ought to know. Turns out he lived there 8 years. I called his place of work and said, "Is the president's son?" And I named him there. They said, "Well, he's here, but he's not the president's son." I said, "Well, may I speak to him?" I spoke to him, and it was the president's son. So here's a former president's son working for 8 years with people that don't know his dad was the president of the United States. And I write about him in my book. And recently we had a suggestion, a TV producer wanted us to bring together some presidential kids and sit them on a round table and discuss what life in the bubble's like. So I phoned this kid back, thinking I'd built a relationship with him and maybe he'd come off his island and be a part of a TV show. And they said, he's gone, left no forwarding address. So I guess I ruined his life. I didn't mean to. Maybe there was some other reason. Maybe it was coincidental. But anyway, he was there 8 years and nobody knew who he was. And so some presidential kids, they can, maybe the Johnson kids especially, they could slip away. But it's pretty tough. I mean, a great American baseball player can walk down the streets of the Champs-Élysées and the only body that recognizes him is the American tourist. But presidential kid anywhere in the world, the buzz is out on the street. Here it comes, here they come. Do you know who they are? And there's no escape. Very quickly, when I started working on this, within the first few months of working on this book, I spent 2 years writing it, the 15 years collecting things. Very quickly, from a personal standpoint, it turned from a work of history to a work of psychology and good parenting, because I brought these lessons and these stories back to my wife, and we were learning this, gobbling up as much information as we could. Because here are very brilliant people, presidents of the United States, making mistakes. And one of the things that we learn is good parenting is no big secret. There have been a numbers of studies at universities, and they pretty well conclude the same thing, that there are 4 ingredients in good parenting. And you can't control what your kid's going to do. But the 4 are gentle but firm, with unconditional love, and no favorites. And that's basically it. And there were some great parents. The Garfields are great parents. Every one of their kids are successful. And Rutherford B. Hayes and Lucy Hayes were great parents. Every one of their kids is successful in different areas, different vocations, and every one of them turns out just great. George and Barbara Bush are very successful parents. In fact, I sat down with GW, and I have a tape recording of an interview with him when I said, "What's your parenting philosophy of your mom and pop?" And he laid out this University of Minnesota study point by point, and the study was published 2 years later, so I know that he hadn't read it. But either by accident or design or luck, or the Bushes did a good job with their kids. What happened, the recent elections of 2 Bushes to the governorships, is an extraordinary event in American history. Many of us will say, well, they've got name recognition and they got money, they ought to win, what's the big deal? But a Stevenson ran in Illinois and couldn't win as a governor. A Humphrey ran in Minnesota. It was the only state that Walter Mondale carried against Ronald Reagan. He should win it. He lost it to an independent. A Taft ran in Ohio and couldn't win and lost. A Kennedy was putting together his campaign in Massachusetts, and because of some controversies and fluctuations in the polls, he backed down from a race. Another Kennedy, Kathleen Townsend, Kennedy Townsend, ran just recently near us in Maryland, where Democrats, registered Democrats, outnumber Republicans 2-1 and lost. So whether the child's been the child of a Republican or a Democrat, and no matter how much name recognition they had, no child of a president ever was elected governor of a state, or child of a vice president or a presidential nominee, until 2 Bushes ended up winning. So it is an extraordinary event historically. Yes, but he's not the son of the president. Charlie Taft was the one that ran for governor and lost. Here are some letters from Thomas Jefferson that I thought were fascinating. Jefferson wrote Patsy a letter, and he says, and the letter's in the book, he says, "Here is a list of things you can do to earn my love." Now, when I read that, I thought, boy, I got no hope. I mean, Thomas Jefferson's got to be one of the smartest presidents we ever had, and if he can't see it, what kind of dad could I possibly be, as smart as he is? And TR, if there was a second most brilliant president, many would say that Teddy Roosevelt was. And Teddy Roosevelt openly favored TR Jr., and he wrote him letters telling him so. So I quickly, from a personal standpoint, I did the book, it was history, but from a personal standpoint, I soaked up as much information I could as how to be a good dad, and my wife how to be a good mom, and what we could do. What was interesting is a lot of these kids triumphed anyway when the parent did everything wrong. I think Richard Taylor was a great example of that. Richard Taylor's dad, Zachary Taylor, the president, said, "I hardly know my children nor they know me." And he didn't have him around when he was president of the United States. He didn't want his son in Washington, didn't want him in the city. So he didn't share any of the glory with him either. If any child was abandoned in their life, Zachary Taylor's son, Richard Taylor, was abandoned. And he's one of the greatest of the presidential kids. He becomes one of Lee's generals and wins all these battles. He's the guy that taught Stonewall Jackson how to teach his troops how to march. And, of course, we got that movie coming out in a few days. So, Bush and Adams. I'll say this about that. We'll get into some questions and answers and comments. I'd like to hear your comments about this because I'm here to learn from you too. I was intrigued by the fact that both a Bush and an Adams became president, and what did they do differently? And I found very quickly they couldn't compare them. Not only were they divided by centuries and cultures, but their method of child raising too was very, very different. The John Quincy Adams experience, in my opinion, from a parental standpoint, was an aberration. It was an accident. John Adams went to France with his 11-year-old son, John Quincy, with him. They lived in one room together. They did not know the language. They could not trust Benjamin Franklin, who was the other American there on the team. And they only had each other. They had no television. And a father undoubtedly shared with a son things that he would never share in any other circumstance. It is a rare moment in time. Two men, one 11-year-old boy and another a man in his late 40s, living in the same room, both future presidents of the United States, and they got nothing to see or read or talk to but each other. And they learned the French language together. And John Adams was a bit stunned and a bit hurt that John Quincy learned French quicker than he did. Of course, today we all know why. I mean, we can even, with biofeedbacks, they can even show us how our brain works and why kids learn language quicker than adults do. But John Adams was convinced that his young son was a genius. And John Quincy gained confidence from that he drew on for the rest of his life, because he knew that his dad wasn't faking it, that his dad was really impressed with him. And John Quincy went on to a great career when he was 14 years old. It was a pretty rare thing to have someone that we could trust in the American government who could actually speak French, which of course was the diplomatic language, so we needed him. And he was immediately assigned to a legation, and very quickly, as a young man, he became an ambassador. His career was on its way. As an old man, John Quincy became intrigued with the whole idea of genius. And he wrote a number of essays about what is genius, and he came to the conclusion that genius was just focusing on a particular thing. And I found it interesting because it seemed to me that his genius betrayed him at the end. He couldn't solve a lot of the problems he wanted to solve, even in his own family, and came to the conclusion, maybe realized finally that, hey, I wasn't as smart as I thought I was, but whatever it was, it took him to the top. And the reason I say it was an aberration is because the other brother, Charles, the dad, says, this worked so good with John Quincy, I'm going to go home and do it with Charles. So he comes back to the United States and he tells Abigail, this is so